You made the news a couple of weeks back by essentially talking about how the current US administration is cozying up to Eritrea, looking at dropping sanctions essentially for, I guess, ultimately the ability to perhaps control the Red Sea or have more influence over the Red Sea. Why is this happening now? And why do you think the Trump administration is wrong to go down this route? I think one of the key arguments you make is human rights, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the article that I wrote in Foreign Policy, it argued more for not whether the decision was right or wrong, because actually I think you could argue it on both sides. I think my criticism of the Trump administration is that they were doing it without a proper review of what the sort of second and third order effects of this recognition are going to be, right? And when you start to play this out, you can see that it's fraught with risk, a decision like this, right? It's not simply, a kind of binary decision that is going to be achieved in a vacuum. There are going to be multiple layers. There are going to be multiple ripple effects from such an important policy reversal. And on that score, I just don't think that the Trump administration has thought through the multiple layers of compounding impacts of this decision. So I do think, though, we are at a unique kind of moment with respect to Eritrea right now, given what I said before about the value of kind of Red Sea real estate going up as a result of the Strait of Hormuz, but also as a result of the previous Iranian involvement with the Houthis, instability among Horn of Africa states. So you have seen the United States, I think, recognizing, and the Trump administration specifically, recognizing that it has a unique role to play because no other power can project power and force and stability into the Red Sea like the United States still can, right? And that was obvious, I think, at the beginning of this administration when the Houthis began targeting commercial marine traffic, and the United States responded, with missile attacks against the Houthis. But at the same time that they responded, they were complaining that European powers were incapable or unwilling to defend maritime traffic in the Red Sea, even though Europe depends much more heavily on commercial traffic through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal than the United States does, right? So the United States believes that it's somebody else's responsibility to be stepping up to provide freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, and yet it also recognizes that it is currently the only power that is capable of doing that. So I think you have the Trump administration still realizing that it has an opportunity and an obligation in this region. At the same time, specifically with respect to Eritrea, I think you've seen the Trump administration in places like Mali and in the Sahel take a very different approach than the Biden administration took, right? Which is to say, we cannot allow democracy and human rights and, U.S. values, let's call them, to stand in the way of hardcore U.S. interests in
Hmm.
any region of the world. And so just like you have seen the United States repeal sanctions against leaders in Mali and seek to engage in a new counterterrorism conversation with Malian authorities, even though you're seeing a sliding backwards of democracy and human rights, you're seeing them
Yeah.
deepen their engagement with Russian mercenary forces. That has not stopped the Trump administration from trying to reengage. I think very similarly, we're not seeing any kind of reversal from the Eritrean regime. You're not seeing an opening up, of the political space. You're not seeing Isaias, loosen his grip on political institutions and on government
Yeah.
institutions. And so you're not seeing any, fundamental change in the nature of that regime, but you're seeing Washington say, well, we have now, hard and fast interests in the Red Sea, and it behooves us to have a conversation and an engagement with this regime, as odious as it might be. And we're not even going to speak to that or acknowledge, the internal oppression that goes on there. We're only going to focus on our interests, and you're seeing that, I think, play out across Africa right now. And Eritrea is, I think, poised to benefit from this kind of changing approach to U.S. foreign policy.
And just for context, obviously, Eritrea got its independence from Ethiopia in the early 1990s. It's been called the North Korea of Africa. Whether that's a justified analogy or not, I don't know. But it's an extremely closed country, and it's clear that the quest for independence has not really paid off in terms of opportunities for everyday people. They have indefinite conscription and so on. If the US drops the sanctions, does it potentially have a reputational impact on the US if the situation does not change within Eritrea? Or does the Trump administration see human rights and sort of the internal challenges in the country as a completely separate entity? Because this is a president that's a lot more transactional, for better and for worse.
Yeah, I think that the Trump administration is not terribly worried about its reputation, and frankly, it sees its reputation around decisions like this as pretty unimpeachable, right? Because again, they point to the Biden administration and previous administrations, not simply the Biden administration, as undermining U.S. national security. And essentially cutting off our nose to spite our face when we step back from governments that are not democratic or that are committing human rights abuses and things like that, right? So they have made this argument, I think, and they've convinced themselves of the certainly the moral good that comes with advancing U.S. interests, right? And so whether that applies to critical minerals and looking beyond regimes that again might not be democratic, as is the case in Mali, where the leader of Mali has essentially said we have no aspiration towards democracy. That's not going to stop the United States, and I think similarly, it's not going to stop the United States in a place like Eritrea. I think the thing that concerns me beyond that, though, is the degree to which this policy choice might be driven by Egypt and other outside actors who have their own, I think, long-term strategic plans for the Red Sea and for Eritrea, right? And so the other argument that I raised in my foreign policy article was really more of a concern that the United States be making this decision on its own and not being influenced by what Egypt wants us to do, for example, because we would be playing into somebody else's strategy in the Red Sea. We know that Egypt is trying to isolate and put pressure on Ethiopia, and so the U.S. recognition of Eritrea at this moment would only further Egyptian plans in the region to isolate and put pressure on Ethiopia. And so I'm just calling for a more, kind of holistic view of the entire Red Sea region and Horn of Africa region before we make, I think, strategic blunders going forward without about the kind of second and third order effects.
And just very quickly, the risk that we see with the Houthis, I mean, how big is that? Because that is informing sort of the current environment that we're in to a certain extent. What do they have the capacity to do? And presumably, the support from Iran must be quite limited at this point, because a lot of their proxies, they're not very well funded or supported at the moment due to challenges at home.
No, that's right. And I think that the Houthi threat has been greatly diminished in the last, 2 months of the war in Iran. It's obviously unclear, what that will look like going forward. Their weapons stockpile has largely been left intact. So they still pose a threat. Whether or not they will employ that at some point, whether or not, the Iranians will continue to pull strings like they did previously with the Houthis, remains a question. But their potency is certainly degraded, because even if they were to use the limited stockpile that they have left, that would be exhausted pretty quickly, and then they would pose, even less of a threat to the region. So I think that over time, because of the war in Iran, the Houthi threat is probably diminished. Frankly, the thing that concerns me most about Red Sea security right now is not the Houthis, it's the kind of bilateral free-for-all that we see in the Red Sea. So when you think that, Egypt and Turkey and Bahrain and UAE and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Somaliland and Somalia
Everyone has their
and
own
the United
agenda.
States, China, I mean, everybody, right? We can imagine a scenario here where you're going to have a dozen different national navies floating around a very small area, right? The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is 17 miles wide. You got, a dozen different navies floating through these waters right now, ostensibly providing security, but all of whom are pursuing competing interests or conflicting interests in a very small area, right? And so I think that is a kind of a recipe for disaster.